Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Midpoint.COSA event co-hosted with Accountability Now on the topic of the state of corruption fighting in South Africa today. We're very excited to have you join us on this nearly impossibly topical subject matter after the week we've had in the news. I'd quickly like to take a moment to speak about the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, who are co-hosting this event, and to situate the topic a little bit. And then I would like to hand over to Judge Richard, who's going to be moderating the event. The Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a German political foundation associated with the CDU, the outgoing governing party of Germany of Angela Merkel. And we work to promote democracy globally on the basis of multi-party democracy, the rule of law, and the social market economy. Today's topic rather obviously relates to the rule of law. Now, to situate the debate, I'd like to say that something like the failure of Eskom to generate enough electricity and the enormous debt burden that South Africa faces are an economic crisis for the country. But the crisis of corruption is much, much larger than that, because it represents an existential crisis for us as a society. The modern nation state is an experiment of having millions of people cooperate even though they don't know each other. And to do that, a crucial component is that everybody knows what to expect from each other and that they play by the same rules. The corruption crisis that we are facing is an indication that there is brazen breaking of accepted rules, which may cause a breakdown in societal relations. This should concern all of us, and we should all be fighting to make sure that we stop this development in its tracks. I'd like to refer you to a book which recently came out by Accountability Now called Countering the Corrupt by Paul Hoffman. We will be sharing the electronic copy during this presentation as well, and I recommend that everyone have a look through it because it is a very good reference work to the subject matter. Thank you very much for joining us. It's been a very busy year. If you'd like to see any of our other content, please go to www.themidpoint.org.za and have a look at www.cas, that's K for Kilo, A for Alpha, S for Sierra, .de/South Africa. I hope you enjoy this conversation. I hand the judge the floor.
Thank you very much, Christian. Firstly, thank you to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for arranging this very, very topical discussion, and especially appropriately on today, which very few people, I think, know is International Anti-Corruption Day. Corruption, like load shedding, has become a phenomenon of our daily life in South Africa. Both have had devastating effects on our economy. And add to that the COVID-19 pandemic. To accept all of these things as normal, or any of them as normal, and to go about our business on that assumption carries a huge danger for our society. It weakens not only the will of government to put an end to these evils, but also makes civil society more accepting of them. A further problem is the perceived lack of progress in bringing criminal proceedings against the major culprits of corruption. To people in the street, the women and men in the street, the evidence is so clear, and there are so many leading figures whose integrity has been seriously implicated before the Zondo Commission. So too there are the reports of excellent investigative journalists that write daily in South Africa. As the first chief prosecutor of the United Nations, Yugoslavia, and Rwanda tribunals, I know the problem all too well. Within weeks of my appointment, there were calls by many in the international community for indictments to be issued forthwith against the leaders, President Milosevic of Serbia, President Tudjman of Croatia, and President Izetbegovic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The war crimes alleged against them are said to be notorious, huge, and well covered in the media. The problem, of course, is that a prosecutor cannot rely on hearsay reports, and that is the main source of media reports. Prosecutor cannot hand in as evidence a report, a front-page report in a newspaper, or show a video. My experience was that one could not expect patience on the part of the public. They are the real victims, and the victims want justice, and they want justice quickly. The importance, of course, is to have a transparent system. One can inform people of the problems relating to prosecution without jeopardizing investigations. It is the perception of many that there has been too little transparency in South Africa on the part of the National Prosecuting Authority. There are inevitable suspicions of covers-up and political pressure on the prosecuting authorities. So these are some of the issues I'm sure that our panelists are going to be discussing in today's webinar. We have a really excellent panel. I'm going to introduce them now briefly and then call on them one after the other to avoid interrupting the flow. First, we will hear from Advocate Glynis Breitenbach, the DA Shadow Minister of Justice. Glynis is a former prosecutor in the National Prosecuting Authority. She is a strong supporter of steps being taken to make an anti-corruption unit completely free of any outside influence. Willie Hofmeyr, until recently the Deputy National Director of the National Prosecuting Authority, and he was the head of its all-important asset forfeiture unit. He was an ANC Member of Parliament in the first post-apartheid Parliament. He is the co-founder of the new non-profit organisation Citizens for Integrity. Mr. Hofmeyr introduced integrity testing in the asset forfeiture unit, and he has stated that it should be more widely used. Our third panelist is Galib Galant, who is an attorney and the chief catalyst of Synergy Works. He chairs the Peace Centre and is one of my co-trustees of Accountability Now. He has been active in the Right to Know campaign and also supports the establishment of an independent Chapter 9 institution to both investigate and prosecute serious corruption. So with no further ado, I call on Advocate Breitenbach. Glynis, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Judge, and good morning to everybody. You're absolutely correct, Judge, that people are impatient. Citizens of South Africa are punch drunk from corruption. It's what happens on a daily basis, and people are tired of it. I think people don't even read. I don't think the numbers involved make any impact anymore, huge as they are. Simply because it's all that. I mean, everybody's consumed by it, and we've been very, very, very ineffective in investigating and prosecuting and holding people to account. And so, as you said, there's a lot of suspicion about political interference. There's a lot of speculation about political pressure as the reasons behind the lack of progress. But that being said, the National Prosecuting Authority was hollowed out to a point of complete devastation during the Zuma era. There are very few people left in the National Prosecuting Authority who have the requisite skills to prosecute this type of offence. It requires both skilled investigation and a skilled prosecution. And a lot of people have left, a lot of people with those skills have retired, and the NPA has been remiss in training up new prosecutors to fill that gap. So not only did Advocate Batoy inherit a very bankrupt organization in the sense of skills, she also inherited a politically fraught organization. And she had to deal with all of those issues on a shoestring budget. And she's still having to deal with them on a shoestring budget. So while I am not harshly critical, but mildly critical of the lack of progress, bearing in mind the factors that I've already mentioned, I understand the enormity of her job and the difficulty thereof. People want to see results. They want to see perpetrators being prosecuted and going to jail, and correctly so. They're entitled to that. But there's no political will to go after large-scale corruption, and that's very clear. The budget of the National Prosecuting Authority has been cut twice in succession, despite a lot of pressure from the Portfolio Committee on Justice in Parliament to not cut that budget. And I'm afraid if they don't have money, then they don't have resources, human or otherwise, and their fight against corruption will be seriously hampered, and it will be a very, very slow process. And then, of course, you've got to bear in mind that in order to prosecute corruption successfully, you need skilled investigators in the police to investigate these things, and they suffer an even greater paucity of skills than does the NPA. I believe the police's detective agency, detective academy, has been closed for some years now. So there's absolutely no training offered to police to properly investigate offences, and certainly no training offered to properly investigate intricate, difficult, complex commercial crime. And so that makes the job of the prosecutors even harder, because they have to sort of work with investigators who are not properly skilled, and have to teach them what to do as well as doing their own job. And they're not even all that skilled yet at doing their own job. So the position is not a good one. And as long as the National Prosecuting Authority is not given sufficient money to procure those skills, because it will take a long time to train it, so they need to procure those skills from the outside, so that those imported skills can be used to train up existing prosecutors more. And as long as they don't have any technical ability, they have no cyber forensic capacity, they have no forensic accounting capacity, they have not a lot of IT capacity. All of those things are essential in the fight against corruption. And as long as that is the case, and it's going to be that way for some time, I don't see the National Prosecuting Authority.
Hi, Glynis. Unfortunately, your sound is cut out. Maybe you've gone onto mute. We'll try it for a moment. And Glynis is out. So I suggest perhaps we move on to Khalib.
Right, sorry. Willie, are you with us? Willie Hofmeyer seems to have faded. So perhaps, Galip, can we come to you? Galip Galan, over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Judge Goldstone. Yeah, so I guess Glynis dove in at the deep end and highlighted the issues around the NPA, and I guess those issues also are alive for us right now. But maybe just to pull back from that, that corruption has got a number of aspects. There's a legal component to corruption, and we're talking a lot about the legislation, and then the institutions, either that have to investigate and prosecute or eradicate corruption. There's a political aspect, I think, that we also need to be mindful of, and Glynis in her introduction also highlighted the political component. The hollowing out of institutions was a political act. The cutting of budgets of something like the NPA is a political act, because Parliament controls those budgets. And so where the political will isn't, you're going to find lip service to certain priorities, but not the resources. And we've seen that over the years, particularly under the Zuma administration. We saw a number of even Chapter 9 institutions come to Parliament annually to say we need more money. in order to do our job, which is an oversight, an important oversight function. I remember the former public protector, for example, Tuli Madonsela, really crying about the budgetary cuts. And part of her job, obviously, also was to look at maladministration in the state sector. And then there's a third element to anti-corruption work, which is an ethical or moral dimension. And I think we mustn't forget that aspect, because there has to be a question that comes up for us, that in the middle of a pandemic, for example, COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that we are investigating is PPE corruption, and we have a former health minister implicated in the diversion of funds meant to support our efforts at dealing with the outbreak of the pandemic in South Africa. That has not only a financial and legal component, there's also something about the ethics of that. That in the middle of a health crisis, what you do is you undermine the rollout of health services to the population. So if we are to work against corruption, we need to deal with the hollowing out of our institutions. And one of the consequences of the hollowing out of our institutions has been the hollowing out of public trust. That's probably seen most clearly in the results of our local government election. The public doesn't trust our political system. But that's a really big obstacle to overcome. One of the things, and it isn't helped by a lack of transparency, for example, about what is being done. So while we need to fill up hollowed out institutions, on one hand, that's, if you think about the Scorpions before, they had about over 500 staff. The inspector in the ID under Hermione Cronier only had 120. So 1/4 of the staff, right? So we need to fill up also with skilled personnel these institutions. That's true. But we also need to work on filling up the hollowed out trust that the public sits with. So we see that even in the way that the public also then beats up on institutions like the NPA, really crying for some kind of results. Anti-corruption work is complex. And in a virtual world as well, there are skills that maybe even former investigators won't have. So there's a new set of skills, a new terrain that we need. So it's complex and complicated. And doing proper investigations takes time. But in a situation where there's a lack of trust in the institutions, and former NDPPs were also seemingly captured, it's really important that the NPA, for instance, in this case, what we're talking about, does better in terms of taking the public into its confidence. So transparency, reporting more regularly about the state of investigations, not necessarily the content thereof, is really important. But we also need to work on the ethical dimension, because even if we get some high-profile convictions and people go to jail and they wear the orange jumpsuits, which everybody is calling for, I think we're still missing a beat, because the culture that has been allowed to grow, that in fact supports all of this tenderpreneurship or corrupt activities. The finger pointing, you should be taking action against that politician and that business person, but not if he's from my party. That sort of culture that continues to allow for corruption also needs to be addressed. And that, I think, is not only a top-down response, it has to come also from the ground up, because culture sits in everybody. Maybe just finally to say, so one issue that we have done is we've established the State Capture Commission, right? The Zondo Commission, as a trust rebuilding exercise, I would say. It's meant to bring some transparency and cast some light on these nefarious activities. But the Commission has no prosecutorial powers. So if we leave it there, the Commission is again going to promise us some things, tantalizing us with these jaw-dropping revelations on a daily basis, but without any consequence. And so building the trust is really important. And we spent millions and millions of rand now doing the information gathering. We need to still put more resources into getting those cases to a successful conviction. So on a beyond reasonable doubt basis, getting those convictions. If we don't do that, the confidence of the public, I think, will be, it'll be yet another unfulfilled promise. So it's really important that we get this piece right. And so fixing the NPA is really important, but certainly from an accountability now perspective, what we would want to call for is for an independent organization, a Chapter 9 institution. One of the things that our courts also have elaborated on is the STIRS principles, right, in the Glenister cases, which means that you have to have a specialized, independent, resourced, skilled institution where people have tenure. And those are important aspects. The ID lacks two very important considerations. One is that they're a temporary organ, and secondly, they're not independent. And so we should be pushing for a specialized organ that really has the powers to take what has been started at the Zondo Commission forward. Maybe lastly to say that the political will seemingly is there. The ANC at its last Congress undertook to establish such an institution. But as a political party, it is too fractured to carry through that particular mandate. And so that's the challenge that we sit with in civil society, is that in confronting the corrupt and then working to counter them, we really have to identify and acknowledge the cracks that are there in our institutions, in the processes, in the political arena, and then in the ethical culture that we need to put pressure on all of the above.
Sorry, Judge Goldstone, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me? Right, we seem to have lost Willie Hofmeyr. Do you have any update on that, Chris?
We're following up on him, yes.
Right. Well, Glynis, you were cut off, I think, before you came to the end of your remarks. But are there any aspects that Galip spoke about that you would like to comment on at this stage?
Yes, thank you, Judge. Certainly, I fully support the idea of a independent corruption fighting organism. I think it should be housed, logically housed in terms of Chapter 9 of our Constitution, which would satisfy all the STIRS requirements and put it outside of the realm of, well, largely outside of the realm of political interference. It would make it so much easier to recruit skilled people, because they would have that assurance that there would be no minimum of political interference, and they would have security of tenure, which is very important. If you're going after big fish, you need security of tenure. Otherwise, you get hounded out of whatever organization you're in. So that process is underway. We're busy with a private members bill mooting exactly that institution in Parliament. We hope to have it ready for some sort of presentation early in the new year. It's a constitutional amendment, so it's a tedious process. It has to go through the Constitutional Review Committee, and then it has to go to Parliament. At some point in the course of this process, I hope to convert it into a committee bill. And by that I mean I hope to convince the Justice Portfolio Committee as a committee to support the bill. And that makes the passage of it through the various stages in Parliament much quicker and much easier. And it makes sense for the Justice Portfolio Committee to be supportive of such a bill in the best interests of South Africa and South Africans. So I sincerely hope that I'm able to convince the other parties. The DA has already agreed to that process and supports the idea of a committee bill. I'm hoping to convince the other parties as soon as we have a workable draft of the bill to give to them to look at. I hope to convince them to support the bill, and I'm optimistic that we'll be successful in that regard. Those are my...
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for that. We'll certainly be watching closely the developments, and let's hope that this happens soon in the new year. I would like to raise the issue of transparency. It's all important for public trust. Let me give one simple example from our own personal perspective. Load shedding. It's a nuisance, and it causes a lot of economic harm, and it's from a personal point of view, it's a nuisance having to rely on an inverter if one's lucky enough to have one, or be completely in the dark if one hasn't. What makes it a little bit easier for me to understand is that Eskom has, certainly over a number of months, explained the reasons for load shedding, and explained why emergencies arise because this or that power station breaks down. We now hear about sabotage. It's not pleasant to have this information, but certainly speaking for myself, it makes it easier to understand the reason for it, and that makes it more easily acceptable. In the case of the National Prosecuting Authority, it seems to me there's a lack of transparency. The reasons that you, Glynis, have given have come from you, but they haven't come from the National Director of Public Prosecutions. Shouldn't she be holding regular press briefings, media briefings? Shouldn't she be telling people what her problems are? Because as unpalatable as they may be, they will certainly make people more understanding of the delay that everybody is complaining about. I mean, if you take this week the resignation of the head of the Special Investigation Unit, Advocate Hermione Cronje, the public has a right to know why she has resigned. I find it unacceptable that the National Director tells the Portfolio Committee that she cannot provide any reasons for the resignation. There's this lack of transparency, I think, which is one of the main causes of a lack of trust and impatience on the part of public. I'd be interested to hear your views on that, Glynis.
Yes, Judge, I agree with you. I found yesterday's interaction somewhat disappointing and unsatisfying. The National Director made it very clear that she was not going to discuss the reasons for the resignation of Hermione Cronje, which I found mildly concerning. As you say, the public is entitled. She was paid from the public purse. It was appointed with great fanfare, and great expectations were created with the creation of the ID. And if it hasn't worked, or it's not working, or there are hiccups, then certainly the public is entitled to know. And I absolutely agree with you about transparency. If you know, however unpleasant the prospect of having the information is, it's so much more easy to deal with if you know what's going on. And your example of load shedding is an excellent one. So nobody likes it, but you can form an understanding of the necessity for it, and it doesn't irritate quite so much. So the national directors yesterday demonstrated, and on Monday at a press conference, in my view, demonstrated a kind of uncomfortable relationship with the press, and a kind of uncomfortable relationship with what I think she perceives as public pressure, which I find out of sync with her job. Of course, she can't discuss intimate details of cases, and of course she can't disclose information that would harm the investigation or prosecution. We all understand that. But that does not mean that there can't be a much greater degree of transparency, in my view. And there should be, and she should be encouraging a good relationship with the press. In South Africa, we've been blessed with a very good press. If in the awful Zuma years, when the NPA was hobbled completely and the police were ineffective and every other investigative entity was completely shattered, it was the investigative journalists who did that job, who exposed the rot, who did excellent work in excellent forensic work in making information available. And you're quite right. A prosecutor can't prosecute on the basis of a news report. You can't hand it in. But the fact of the matter is the journalists went much further than that in those state capture investigations that they did. Amar Bongani and the Daily Maverick did forensic investigations. They accessed forensic documentation, which they published. And so it remains only for the National Prosecuting Authority or the police to authenticate and verify the information. The work is largely done for them. So, it's not true that they're starting from scratch, and it's not true that that they have to start over. That information is there. It exists. It's available. In order for it to be admissible, it merely needs to be authenticated and verified. So there is no real reason for such a long delay. But if the National Director would consider an approach that's more user-friendly, if she would engage with the public, say, twice a year or 3 times a year, and say, these are the problems that we're experiencing, and these are some of the reasons why we're making slower progress, and this is how far we are down the road, and we can look forward to a result more or less then without putting unnecessary pressure on herself or the prosecutors or the investigators, I think South Africans would be very happy to know that progress is being made, and then the pressure that the NPA is now perceiving as bad pressure would be good pressure. People would be supportive and happy to see progress and understand the delays. and I think it would be good for everybody in that case, and then there would be no there wouldn't be this antagonism, which is unfortunate.
Right, Khalid, before we go to the public, are there any aspects of transparency that you would like to comment on?
I mean, I think I want to support everything that you've said and that Glenys has said in terms of how greater openness and transparency can work to rebuild trust. Maybe there's a caveat, which is the culture within the NPA that had grown and flourished under the previous NDPP. And it's really, I would think, very difficult to root out that culture. So I think the task that Shamila Batoy has is a difficult one. That she can take the public more into a confidence is a no-brainer. The previous NDPP, for example, was famous for a number of things, but particularly for coming out quite vocally against whistleblowers from within the NPA, who investigators who were working with journalists, etc. So there was a big fanfare around leaks that were coming out because of the political obstacles within the NPA at the time. So if you have an institution, for example, that doesn't value whistleblowing in the context of countering corruption, it's also problematic. And so our government, and particularly the very securocratic architecture that has grown up during the Zuma administration, or has come to the fore, and that we're still sitting with now, is not friendly to people like whistleblowers, for example, and in fact prosecute whistleblowers. So that culture of openness and transparency is, I think, also multifaceted. We need to look at that. What the current NDPP could do is to set the tone, and that, I think, is crucial. So all of the stuff, similar, you gave the example of ESCOM, the National COVID Council and the president's family meetings, for example. What's the one criticism about that? Is that he doesn't allow any questions about the coronavirus, right? So yes, he comes on and he does a lot to calm the situation, etc., etc. So to that extent, he's open. But in terms of critical engagement with the public around coronavirus, that space isn't there. And I think what we are seeing from a civil society perspective, in terms of what we're asking for rebuilding that trust, is that institutions and the leaders within those institutions need to take us into their confidence.
Oh, thanks, Philip. Chris, maybe this is a good time to go to questions. Do we have questions come in that you want to put to Glenys and Galeb?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Also, just to update everyone that Advocate Willy Hofmeyr is not able to dial back in due to power failure, ironically, given the example you gave earlier. I think a good place to start maybe would be on the very general point of Johannes Meintjes, who's asking really what effect does visible, widespread corruption, as indicated by the Zondo Commission, have on the rule of law in South Africa? Do you think it has a function in undermining people's willingness to be law-abiding?
Glenys, do you want to have a go at that?
Sure. Absolutely. It affects people's view on whether to be law-abiding or not. In my experience in South Africa now, people, there's no consequence management. There's no consequences for bad behavior. We haven't had successful large-scale corruption trial in the last 10 years. And the candle now is worth the game. It's the chance of getting caught have drastically dropped, and that having been done, the chances of being successfully prosecuted have also dropped dramatically. So the risk is small, and everybody's is jumping aboard and having a go at it. And you mentioned ethics earlier, and it's a moral dilemma. Of course it is. People seem to have lost their grip on ethics, and their moral compass seems to have gone completely haywire. People now have no difficulty. For instance, if you're stopped by a traffic officer, of trying to bribe your way out of it, and people think that that's acceptable. Well, it isn't. That little bit of corruption is just as bad as a big corruption, because that's where it comes from. As soon as corruption as a way of life becomes acceptable, that's the problem. So South Africans need to start taking a bit of responsibility for it as well, and it has to be a bottom up, as you suggested, as well as a top down. And until we see successful prosecutions with serious consequences, people are going to think that they can get away with it. So it's a societal issue that needs to be addressed on many levels.
Uh-huh. Well, Galib, you raised the question of morals and ethics. It seems to me to be crucial. If everybody's breaking the law, why should the law-abiding citizen be the exception and lose out when everybody's making a profit out of dishonesty? It is a moral issue. It really is. It to me seems almost inconceivable that people would steal money that are given to feed hungry people. That money is stolen for PPE when people are dying in ICUs of COVID. How do we recover that moral ground? Sorry,
so that's a really tough question. Not just people stole money for PPE, they've even killed people in service of their of the looting, right? So let's not forget Babita Deokaran, the financial officer in the Department of Health in Gauteng, who was assassinated. With a price of 2 million rand being paid to 7 assassins. So there's some serious consequences, and the stakes are really high. I don't know, certainly at the grassroots level, we're in the sort of tail end of 16 days of activism against gender violence, gender-based violence. Now that ends tomorrow. Surely we need 21 days of forming anti-corrupt habits on an annual basis, because it takes 21 days of doing something for a new habit to form. This feels like something said tongue-in-cheek, but actually, if we are to change the culture, then we are talking about the JMPD officer that accepts a bribe for not giving you a ticket, as well as the driver who pays the bribe, all the way up to a president that creates an environment of patronage and largesse that filters down then to certain people. So that cultural piece is something that I think we could probably leverage, I think, in the space at the local government level. I'm very curious about the results of the LGE, the local government elections recently. Citizens voted with their votes or not voting. but they sent a message to all political parties that we're really tired of the way that you do business. There's a level of citizen activism there that could, if harnessed and seeded properly, shift that culture with a focus on building accountability from the grassroots up. So while we're dealing with the grand scale corruption, state capture, etc., growing that culture from below is also important. And I think we need to pay attention equally to that. And my hope, certainly, for a Chapter 9 institution who gets this mandate is also to promote that culture. Not just, if you think about the Human Rights Commission's mandate, it's to protect and promote the rights, right? So it's about prosecuting the rights on the one side, but it's also about promotion of rights. And so that, it could be part of the mandate of a Chapter 9 institution.
Thank you very much. Chris, back to you.
Just skimming through the questions, there's interesting comments about resources. So on the one hand saying, can more money not be provided to the NPA to do its job? Alternatively, human resources be provided free of charge by the legal fraternity to make them do their job? I guess the question that runs out is, are resources the limiting factor? If the NPA had the resources, would prosecutions follow?
Dennis?
Well, if the NPA had the resources, certainly it would go a long way to ensuring that prosecutions follow. But the legal fraternity, to provide services free of charge, that doesn't pay the bills. So lawyers, need to work to earn money to pay the overheads of which there are many. So while most lawyers are prepared to do some pro bono work, they can't just do pro bono work. And prosecutions take a long time. I mean, you'll be out of, even the Section 38 appointments where the NPA Act allows for outside counsel to be appointed to prosecute cases where the skills in the NPA are not available. Even that is a difficult situation because you're taking counsel out of practice for 6, 7, 8 months. There's a lot of damage done to their practice in that time. They're unavailable during the day. They have to, play catch up at night, but there's only so much you can do. And so by necessity, the state doesn't pay what they would earn in fees, and so there's a financial implication for them. But also, the difficulty of going back to a practice after 6 or 7 or 8 months in a criminal court, multiplicity of problems. More money, yes. We've the Portfolio Committee on Justice, the chairperson, Bulelani Magunisha, made a strong case for the budget to not be cut. It put a lot of pressure on his own party to not cut the budget of the NPA. It didn't help. Now I understand that the cake is so big and everyone can only get so much of it, but there's no difficulty in the 16 billion bailout for SAA, but the budget of the National Prosecuting Authority gets slashed. So one questions the priorities, and if you have to look at that kind of comparison, then you must question the political will. And Khalid said, yes, there's a political will because they said they're going to start this institution. Well, talk is cheap, We haven't seen anything. We've seen no action to establish such a unit. And if they're not giving money to the police and to the National Prosecuting Authority, where would they find money for this unit? So, resources would certainly help. Of course, resources would help. And many people have, with the establishment of the ID, I must say, in private practice, many people have phoned up and said, put me in touch with these people. I want to offer my services free of charge. And of course, that's helpful. But it can only be for a very specific and limited period of time. Otherwise, it has serious economic implications and financial implications for the person volunteering. So it's not, free of charge is not a long-term solution to the problem. A much bigger budget for the National Prosecuting Authority is a prerequisite, and then a much more effective spending thereof in order to address paucity of resources is the only way forward, in my view.
Chris?
Perhaps just before, Chris, you go to the next question, just is the parliamentary budget the only pot of money from which the NPA can draw or the ID can draw? And so the asset forfeiture unit, so where one of the things that the NDPP was talking about was even though they've been slow on prosecuting individuals, what they have been doing is recovering lots of money. So there's a question around where money is recovered, where does that go? Back into the fiscus? Does it go to fund perhaps these investigating activities? And then allied to that is also a question around if, for example, we ever get successful convictions on the VBS scandal, let's say. What happens to the Gogo who lost their money? Do they get that back, for example? So in terms of tangible outcomes, right? What's the consequence of a conviction? Because yes, you can have someone languishing in jail, comes out after 10, 15 years or whatever, but the real consequences for the people who've been disadvantaged by the act of corruption, what happens to them, is, I think, quite an important question for us to think about. Yeah.
Thank you, Galeb. Chris, next question.
Earlier on, Glynis mentioned the DA's bill and converting it into a committee bill. At the moment, just investigation is part of the bill. Do you think if both prosecution and investigation were included in the proposal, it would more likely become a committee bill?
Not necessarily. I think there's a lot of political will in this portfolio committee to the committee functions, I must say, exceptionally well. In this sixth parliament, the Justice Portfolio Committee really does work very effectively and efficiently, and that's very largely thanks to the approach and the attitude of the chairperson. So he runs a non-partisan committee, and all of the members work towards doing what we're supposed to do in portfolio committees, which is not a political arena at all. It's a place where public representatives are sent to represent the citizens of this country, and that is what is allowing us the space to do, and it's very refreshing. So there's a lot of goodwill in the committee, and I don't believe it will be difficult to persuade them to support that bill. The ability to prosecute outside of the National Prosecuting Authority is difficult. At the moment, the Constitution says the National Prosecuting Authority in the country. And I don't think that you can have several different organizations, all with prosecuting capabilities and authority, without them being played off against each other and without causing a serious jockeying for space for court time, and who will get preference. So it brings a whole lot of technical issues that would need to be ironed out. Even when the specialized commercial crime courts were initiated, those prosecutors, while they fall under the final jurisdiction of the National Director of Public Prosecutions, they were a separate business unit from the National Prosecuting Service. And so there was always this jockeying for court time, space in court, who got preference. And so that becomes a very difficult thing to deal with, and it it would perhaps be something to look at down the line, but I would imagine that the first prize would be to get such an institution set up, such a bill passed, and then as time goes by and the setup is in place, then you could look at ways to improve it. Perhaps to go for the entire whole hog initially would be a bridge too far.
I don't know where there's a sound, a consistent sound of it sounds like a motor car alarm. Is it?
That's not at my house.
Oh. Anyway, let's continue as best we can.
Just with regard to Khaleb's comment on the asset forfeiture issue, the money is so forfeited, or eventually goes to, if there's a final forfeiture, it goes to the criminal asset recovery account, the CARA account, and from that account, of course, the National Prosecuting Authority is a beneficiary. It disburses the money as the kitty gets full. And often there's quite a lot of money in there, but there's strict rules about how it gets disbursed. And first of all, it must go to, if the victims of the crime are identifiable and can be traced and found, then they must be reimbursed. After that, it goes to law enforcement, so crime fighting. Some of it would go to the National Prosecuting Authority, some of it would go to the police, some may go to the revenue services, some may go to financial intelligence. It depends, wherever there's a big need, and you make an application to the CARA fund for funding, and then depending on how much there is and how important your request appears to be, it gets allocated. But the first prize is to return the money to the person who lost it.
Right. Well, I see we've got about 2 minutes left, and I think the time has come for a minute each to Caleb and to Glynis to make closing statements. And is there any light in the tunnel, Caleb? Please ignore that comment and deal with what you wish in your closing statement.
I think there's a moment. I do think that this very dark tunnel does have some light. And the light, I agree with some of the comments in the Q&A, must come from broadly civil society. That in fact, we need to be far more activist in putting pressure on our political leadership, our elected political leadership and others, our representatives, and on institutions to take up these issues. We can't just leave it up to the institutions. And I think that's, for me, one of the things, that the relationship between citizens and government, broadly speaking, needs to be rebooted as well. So more active citizens is one aspect. Filling up the gaps in our hollowed out institutions, absolutely, is important. And we've spoken at length about that. Ensuring institutions by themselves are not enough. And so we've had Chapter 9 institutions even that have been undermined by the person appointed to lead that institution, right? I won't mention one that's currently under scrutiny as well in Parliament. So the institution is also about the people inside the institution, and that's a really important point. But yeah, I do think that there's a light. It's maybe flickering right now. I don't believe that we're a failed state yet. We're limping, but I think that we can, step by step, rebuild this.
Thank you very much, Caleb. Any final sentence from you, Glynis?
Thanks, Judge. Yes, I think I agree. There is a tiny little light at the end of the tunnel. At this point, I'm not entirely sure it's not a train. But I agree that we need citizen activism. Citizens must start taking control of their own destiny. They must demand accountability from elected people. They must demand accountability from institutions, and they themselves must take some responsibility for this predicament that we find ourselves in. And if you take care of the pennies, the pounds will take care of themselves. So people have got to stop regarding the law as a convenience. If you feel like following it, you do, and if it doesn't suit you, you don't. And that means from not overtaking on a white line to not parking in a disabled parking bay to not driving up one ways constantly the wrong way and thinking it's okay because nothing will happen. And if we start taking care of the nuts and bolts, eventually we will be able to take care of everything. If society says it's not acceptable, then we can start building on that. But as long as South African society thinks that the law is a bit of an inconvenience, we've got serious problems.
Fine. Well, thank you very much. It remains then for me to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for this webinar, and to give a hearty vote of thanks to our two panelists, to Glynis and Galib, and to express regret that Willie Hofmeyr in the end, for technical reasons, was unable to join us. So, Chris, over to you to close the proceeding.
I think from our side, from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I'd just like to say again, thank you very much for everyone to join, and also for the panelists, and of course you, Judge, to chair this discussion. We are now going into our summer recess, and I'd just like to say again, thank you very much. It's been a very busy year for the foundation. We've produced a lot of content, and I hope that you can have a look at it, because there is so much that we need to understand about South Africa's political trajectory in order to improve it. So thank you very much. I wish you all a good festive season, and take care and stay safe. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye all.
Cheerio.